Hi, in this video I'm going to go through a list of reasons why your car might be misfiring or having a rough idle. I'm going to separate the reasons into fuel, and then I'll talk about ignition, and then I'll talk about some sensors, and then I'll talk about compression, air and vacuum. Right, starting with the fuel delivery. Here is the pump. So what happens is, in your vehicle you have a fuel tank and the fuel is sucked in and the pump gets the fuel to the fuel filter. Now if the pump goes faulty, you'll most definitely have a misfire, rough idle. Now the fuel pump pumps the fuel into the fuel filter. So if your fuel filter is clogged, that will also restrict fuel getting to your fuel injectors, also causing a misfire. It's important to change the fuel filter regularly. If the area you stay in is known to have a dirtier fuel, then you would need to change the fuel filter even more regularly. Now the fuel filter, if it is clogged, puts more pressure on the fuel pump. Therefore, these two devices work together. So it's always important to make sure your fuel filter is in good working order by making sure that it is changed regularly. Now from the fuel filter to the engine, there's a series of pipes. Now it is not a common problem, but I have seen it where a pipe was faulty. So for example, in this car, here is the fuel pipe going to the fuel injectors. Now the fuel travels from the fuel filter all the way to the engine to your fuel injectors. If there's any damage to any of the fuel lines, there will be a misfire. What I have seen, while it's not common, is a tiny nick on one of the pipes. Maybe a mechanic nicked it, or maybe it was a manufacturing defect, and was a tiny hole in one of the fuel lines. And what it was doing, it was making an intermittent fault. So the misfire was only happening after a certain amount of time. Air was getting into the pipe, and therefore it was diluting the fuel, causing a misfire at the spark plug. Now once the fuel has been piped to the engine, we have the fuel injectors. The fuel injectors do get dirty over time. They can be serviced, so they do not necessarily have to be replaced. All one needs to do is take it to a fuel injector and carburetor specialist, and they service the fuel injector by changing the seals and the filters. Sometimes you'll find there's little sediment that gets caught in the little gauze or the filter of the fuel injectors. Testing the functionality of the fuel injector is pretty straightforward. You just need a multimeter, set it to ohms, and measure the resistance across each one of these coils. If you have a bench test supply, you can also listen for the operation of the solenoid. So here I connect the positive and negative here across the terminals. And there I heard the solenoid opening and closing. Right, so there you can see the test rig. The fuel injectors put on the rig, and there you can see they are tested. They are tested to see that they will operate at the same rate. They've been cleaned, given ultrasound, filters have been changed. Now once the fuel gets sprayed into the chamber, it's the spark plug that ignites that fuel in order to create a controlled explosion which builds up pressure and pushes the piston down. Now the spark plug has a timed spark from the DME. What happens is a signal is sent to a coil to increase the voltage, and that spark plug transmits that voltage to the electrode over here. And what happens is an electrical arc is formed here which ignites the fuel. So if the spark plug is faulty, it will not ignite the fuel and you'll have a misfire. Now the part that gives the spark plug that spark, that high voltage, is called a coil. Now the coil is basically a transformer. What happens is the low voltage signal is present at the input of the coil, and the coil increases that voltage to a much higher voltage, which is then fed into the spark plug, and the spark plug makes the arc. Now the coil may deteriorate over time. So if the coil is not providing that high voltage for the spark plug, we'll also have a misfire. Now sometimes we have intermittent faults with these coils. For example, on this particular car, this coil was actually only going faulty when the temperature of the car had increased. What was happening is the dielectric strength of the coil was breaking down at higher temperatures, probably because of oil that had seeped into the side of the coil here. Because if I squashed these little rings here, I noticed oil was sitting on the side here. Now that brings me to the next fault, which is often present in the location where you'll find your coil and or spark plug. Now what happens is this is sitting on the top part of the engine where your tappet cover or valve cover is. Now this is a common failure on many cars. Right, this is a V8, so on this car I have two of these, but on most cars you'll just have one. And this is a plastic cover on this car which covers the camshaft and the valves. And what happens is there's a seal that runs around here, and it often wears out and it starts sweating and oil seeps out of here. But because the spark plugs are sitting inside here, we often find oil seeping into where the spark plug is seated. So for example, on this car we have a tube, and this tube is supposed to keep oil out of this little space here. So what happens on many cars is we find oil seeping in, and the spark plug is often sitting in a pool of oil. Sometimes even the coil is sitting in the same pool of oil. Right, on this 4-cylinder Mercedes compressor, here are the coils, and a common problem in this car is this gasket leaks and oil also falls into the spark plug chamber. The coil may be fine, the spark plug may be fine, but when there's oil pooled around it, it won't work properly, and therefore we get a misfire. Here's an example of a spark plug bay completely filled with oil, and the one next to it also with oil, and there you can see the end of the pencil coil completely wet from the oil. Now this is called a pencil coil, and there are different types and shapes of coils, but the principle remains the same. So if the coil and/or spark plug is sitting in oil, that will reduce the dielectric strength between the coil and your cylinder head, which means that arcing may take place. Instead of there, the arcing may take place from the coil to the side wall of your cylinder head, and that will reduce the arc over there, therefore causing a misfire. So very important is to check if there's any oil leak. So an oil leak can reduce the timed spark of your cylinder. It's quite easy to solve that problem. One can quickly do an inspection to see if there are any oil leaks in any one of your cylinders. And also, if you're not finding any oil leaks, but you do want to check if the coils are fine, you can actually swap the coils. And sometimes you can even unplug the coils while the car is on. Some cars can tolerate that. But keeping in mind that if there is a sustained misfire, many cars will shut off the cylinder. It will actually shut off the fuel injector so as not to cause an explosion. We don't want fuel constantly being pumped into the cylinder, because then if the spark eventually does arise, we'll have a very strong downward stroke because of that extra pressure, because of the increased fuel. So what happens is, if the misfire is present for 10, 15, 20 seconds, depends on the car, it actually shuts off that cylinder. So if you are swapping your coils and moving spark plugs around, just be sure to switch off your car and then switch it back on to do your test. Otherwise, the misfire may just be there because the ECU has actually forced that cylinder to shut down. Now, the next category is to do with compression and vacuum. So this is to do with breathing. So over here, I've got a pipe, and if this pipe is damaged, I will then have a misfire. I also have a crankcase vent valve on the side here. It looks something like this. And if this is damaged, I may also have some extra smoke and possibly a misfire. Now, in order to get air into the engine, we've got a pipe over here coming from the air intake side. The air comes through the air filter, goes over here and goes past the mass airflow sensor and then into the engine. Now on the other side, it's got a repeat because this is a V8, so it's a duplicate on each side on this car. Now if there is any damage specifically after the sensor here, we will find a misfire. On this particular car, it's quite common to have a tear over here. Now, if there's a tear on this joining pipe, we'll find that the sensor's measure of airflow will not correlate to the airflow that is going into the engine, because some air will be coming through over here. That will cause a rough idle and a misfire. A faulty mass airflow sensor also causes a misfire. On this C-Class compressor, there's a mass airflow sensor over here. If this is faulty, we will definitely have a misfire. There's also a vacuum hose running underneath here. It's like a breather hose. If that hose is damaged, we'll also have a misfire. So if there are any leaks in the air intake, we may have a misfire. Now, what can also cause a misfire is if there is a lack of compression in your cylinder. For example, if the cylinder head gasket is blown, air escapes from that cylinder and that causes a misfire or a rough idle. Lack of compression can also be caused from worn piston rings. Usually you know if you have that because you will see quite a lot of smoke. You'll burn quite a lot of oil in the chamber, and often piston rings are associated with a blue smoke, and if it's a leaking head gasket, you might find a white smoke. Why it's white is because you're probably going to be burning coolant as well. Because in the cylinder head, there are tiny channels where coolant flows in order to help cool the cylinder. Now, what can also cause misfires are faulty wiring. For example, there are wires that go into the back of the coil. If they're frayed or if they've lost continuity, that will also cause a misfire. We've got a camshaft sensor. If that sensor is faulty or the wiring to the sensor, that will also cause a misfire. So it's a good idea to just check the condition of the wiring to make sure it is in good working order. On this car, it's got a Valvetronic motor over here, and if this is faulty, I'll also get a misfire. If any valve in the engine has gone bent for whatever reason, we'll also get a misfire. It will not seal properly and charge will escape when it is trying to close off that port. Right, so those are the common causes of misfiring. There are some other causes which are probably not as common. For example, if you bought fuel and there was water in the fuel, occasionally the underground tank at the petrol station may get water seeping in, and that can also cause a misfire if there is an incorrect fuel mixture. A catalytic converter that is worn out, clogged, can also cause a misfire. A blocked EGR valve, a broken oxygen sensor, a crack in your valve cover, tappet cover, any damage in your valve train, so spring, lifters, and then obviously the timing. So this is your timing chain or your timing belt. This is what keeps the camshaft in synchronism. There have been some recalls on timing chains. We're finding that the timing chain was actually stretching, and all of these cause a misfire, actually damages the engine. And then lastly, a faulty ECU of your car. So basically a malfunctioning computer. All right, so thanks for watching and cheers.